Hi, this is Phil Parker and podcast number 10 about developing stories. And in this one, we're looking at two other story types out of the 10 that actually sort of work in screen narrative and, to be honest, in most other forms of narrative that we can actually mention. The two I want to look at in this particular discussion are The Gift Taken Away and Rites of Passage. Now, The Gift Taken Away is an interesting story type in that for a long time it's not been used that often for main protagonists. The idea of this story is that you illustrate that the character has something, a gift. Now, this may take the form, in fact, of another human being, a child or a partner, but quite often it's a skill or an ability, which they then lose. Now, this is easy to understand in terms of motivation if someone, kidnaps your child or takes your partner away, or that they die, for instance, and you're left with what do you do about that. It's much more difficult to actually necessarily set up the idea of someone losing a skill or ability. It's much easier to understand this in terms of someone losing a certain status, a position in an organization or a family or even a society. And at that point, they set out on a journey to actually regain their position in the society or the family, or in fact, to recapture their missing child or partner. Now, there have been many thrillers done in the recent past where we can think about, everything from Taken right the way through to ideas of things like The Ring being taken in Lord of the Rings. The idea of motivating a character, quite often the antagonist as well as or the protagonist, to actually pursue a particular storyline throughout the plot, which is clearly about them trying to get back that thing they've lost. Now, this can take the form of many journeys, obviously, and work across all genres. There is even the point that in terms of certain types of romance, one actually is dealing with the idea that someone has lost a partner and they've therefore lost love, and they're in fact trying to regain love throughout the whole film, or in fact reconnect with their partner. This is the classic instance where you get ghost partners appearing in romance stories, and yet they don't actually turn into horror stories because that's not really what this is about. This is about the loss of a partner. The most strangest version of this in recent times has, of course, been the next 72 hours, where the husband is so motivated by the loss of his wife that he goes to extraordinary lengths, including breaking her out of jail to actually be reunited with her. Now, for these things to be credible, then obviously the audience has to understand not only the nature of the thing that's been lost, which is relatively easy to set up, but also why the person's so motivated to pursue this particular story and this particular loss. If that is not well done, then the audience will not actually make that journey with the character, or they'll find the nature of their problems not either credible, believable, or in some ways just not good enough to be interesting. Now, at this point, you've got to recognize that the nature of this story, like all stories, is the nature of the problems that you set up for your character in their attempt to regain the thing they've lost. If your problems are not credible or interesting, then the story becomes boring or not credible. Ultimately, though, the character does get reconciled to the new situation of either regaining the thing they've lost, a more upbeat feel to it, or gaining something new, which is often the case in many dramas, where the thing that has been sought actually and lost is not the thing that is ultimately gained to replace it. And it's this approach that produces the most sort of interesting developments in personal dramas, where one is actually looking at a character changing. Whereas in, say, a romantic comedy, the idea that someone may have lost their girlfriend or boyfriend or their favorite dog at the beginning of the film, and at the end of the film you're reunited with a new partner, is, classic in that sense, without the character really changing much at all. In this context, it's a very, very simple story type, and the credibility, like I said, rests upon the nature of the problems you create, believing that this person would actually put all this effort having lost the thing that they so cherished. Now, when we come to rites of passage, this is often described as a whole story type or a narrative type, i.e. this is a rites of passage film or a rites of passage, as opposed to a rites of passage story. The point about rites of passage is that it's the idea that we live through various ages as we grow up as human beings. And in the nature of that growing up, we need to learn certain things to move from one stage to the next. Societies have often characterized this by various rituals, many of which are still conducted, though not so formally these days as they were in the past. And in many ways, the classic being the one that we've explored most in cinema is the rites of passage from being an adolescent to being an adult or a young adult. In more recent years, we've seen narratives where many have dealt with the idea of the loss of family, i.e. moving from being the parent to being the adult in either a couple or on your own, or losing work and finding a new identity after that. This is a reflection of the more disjoint nature of modern society, and something we'll talk a lot more about when we come to the next podcast and the concept of the wanderer. But coming back to the rites of passage, here we're looking at the idea that a particular character belongs to a certain stage of their life. They become aware that there is another state that they could be in, another status they might have, or another piece of knowledge or skill they might acquire. They set out to achieve this, normally in the context whereby other people are setting out to achieve it as well, or something very similar, and they initially fail. Now this is quite crucial. If you don't actually show that the character fails, then the right is not in that sense earned dramatically. One has to actually set up the fact that this is a rites of passage. It's not just a simple walking from A to B. You have to fail somewhere along the way in order to gain earn the right on behalf of the audience, and also in terms of earning the motivational understanding from the audience that the character's motivation is clearly carried throughout the whole story. So having realized where they were, where they want to get to, the character then attempts this, fails, and then tries again, having learned something or having undertaken a different approach, which ultimately brings them to a new state of being, which is the new age for them. Now this may, of course, be a very simple thing, like, for instance, actually having sex, which is like a major motivational force and a major rites of passage stories for so many teenage dramas, and in particular comedies, over the last decade. However, the point about the rite of passage is that it is a transitional thing, and it works extraordinarily well in personal dramas where you're expecting characters to make quite substantial changes in their lives and themselves. And this is why this particular story type has worked so well in that genre. But you also find it in some romances, and you also find it in secondary characters in thrillers and horror pieces, where a character actually has to go on a journey and learn a skill to survive in the world that they now find themselves, and they fail initially and then ultimately they succeed. These are sort of classic secondary stories in these other genres, where of course in the personal drama they may be the dominant story and often are. In all of these sort of stories, one is often talking as well about ensembles, because the thing about a rite of passage notion is that you actually only understand fully the nature of the rite of passage if you actually watch two or more people trying to attempt the same thing, and it's your protagonist who actually succeeds or fails in the final analysis. Whereas on the way, you watch other people succeeding and failing in slightly different ways. Now, in this context, it's a great ensemble type of storytelling. And one of the things I want to come back to is the distinction between a story, i.e. the motivation of a single character on a particular storyline, and the concept of the plot, whereby in fact we may have multiple stories, and in the context of a rites of passage narrative, multiple rites of passage stories and a classic ensemble drama.